And good morning, everybody. As I say, I hope I'm new to this sort of forum actually, so I hope you can both hear me and see the slides. And again, yeah, thanks Natalie for the introduction. I just really wanted to start actually by saying thank you very much for the opportunity to come and talk to you today. And thanks to Ian for the invitation. Thanks to Scott for the technical help. Much appreciated. Just as a brief introduction, my name's David Brown. I worked for Natural England for about 11 years now, exclusively in licensing. I've had a variety of different roles, as you probably imagine, but it's been exclusively in licensing. And really since about March, April time this year, I've moved into what we call the complex case unit. And effectively, that's a team that deals with a variety of different areas of work, but I work particularly on licensing. And it's areas of licensing essentially that need a bit of specialist input or need to be handled slightly differently. And that's usually because they're sensitive, or perhaps there've been some changes in legislation and we need to develop a new process. So I'm going to talk to you, as Natalie said, a little bit today about bird licensing preparations for next year, actually. I won't sort of go over, too much all of the problems that we had this year. But I mean, I know Natalie said this in the introduction that there were several issues this year, a variety of problems that we had, and we're endeavouring to put those right. So I wanted to just really talk a little bit first about general licensing, and then I'll move on to individual licensing and what we're seeking to achieve for next year. So yeah, really this slide's just sort of explaining the various issues with general licensing in particular. I deal with species species of bird that were on general license and were removed recently and not so recently, so specifically large gulls. So really this slide just shows that really what happened this year. A lot of you will probably understand this in as far as the GLs didn't include work on European and Ramsar sites, designated sites, which meant that you needed to apply for an individual license to carry out control of those bird species on the general license on those sites. And they also didn't include, of course, the lesser blackback gull this year, as well as the herring gull. So again, we received a lot of applications to control specifically lesser blackback gull and herring gull this year for public health and safety for a variety of purposes, but particularly for health and safety. Now, you'll probably be aware that DEFRA have carried out, they put some interim general licenses in place this year, whilst they were carrying out a more extensive review of general licensing. And they've published some new general licenses on the 9th of November this year. I think the one that's most relevant to you is going to be the public health and safety general license, and there have been some. You'll have seen there have been some changes to that. Specifically, the removal of some species of bird. I'm thinking particularly corvids such as carrion crow and magpie and rook. Jackdaw is still on that general license, but categorised really to particularly to nesting material. But in terms of sites, you also have seen that those general licenses can now be used on those designated sites, which is extremely useful. So I'm just going to move on to individual licensing this year. Apologies in advance for the colouring here, but I think what I just wanted to demonstrate was, I mentioned earlier there about purpose, licensing purpose, of which there are several: conservation, damage to crops, but for this audience, it's particularly public health and safety. And you'll see there that really big chunk of the darker blue colour was the proportion of public health and safety licenses that we received this year. So we received an additional around about the 1,600 mark. So you can see a big proportion of those related specifically to public health and safety. So it's a big area of work for us. And then within that, again, apologies for the colours, they're not ideal, but I just wanted to demonstrate that of those health and safety purpose applications, hopefully you can see that the big areas of the lighter blue and the slightly darker blue relate to herring gull and lesser blackback gull respectively. So it's a big area of work for us. This is just a little bit really about general license and individual license and the differences. And really the reason I put this in is because for a lot of people this year, they were applying for a license for the first time. And, it's like anything, if you're not used to it, if you haven't done it before, it is difficult. And I think people hear the term license and kind of categorize them all together, but actually, certainly a general license and an individual license are like day and night. They're very, very different things. An individual license, whereas you can download a general license from gov.uk and you can look at the various conditions and familiarize yourself with that. With an individual license, you're actually applying for it. And because you're applying for it, of course, we need to assess it, and we can only assess it with a degree of information to assess. In addition to that, you need to meet particularly these 4 tests, and these run through a lot of areas of our licensing. And it really just, I won't read them out, but it just maps out what we're looking for against these tests. So, the obvious one to start is there a problem? What is that problem specifically? What else have you tried? And in other words, why have you ended up at the situation where you need to actually carry out lethal control? There aren't any other alternatives. So it's really just telling that story, if you like, and setting that scene so we can assess that information. I'll just move on to the next slide. So that brings me to sort of individual licensing. This year, as you know, that there were lots of problems. I did quite a lengthy exercise at the end of the licensing season to sort of a lessons learned exercise, really. And I've also had a lot of stakeholder engagement calls to get a lot of feedback, including from the BPCA members, which has been extremely useful. And there were lots of minor problems, but there were some bigger problems really that are categorized into communication and to timeliness of response and to our sort of our position more generally, in terms of advice and guidance. So in order to tackle that, what we're launching in the early part of next year is a new screening phase. Now, I have put in there, you'll see one of the bullet points is the form and guidance available on gov.uk early next year. Before that, hopefully next week, actually, I'll be able to share that screening phase form with prospective applicants, including, so I'll share it with the BPCA members. But essentially the screening phase, and this is quite new well, it's very new actually in terms of licensing. It's allowing applicants to provide a sort of summary of key information. And that's quicker, of course, and we can make a decision quicker on that. And you can see the second bullet point there, that improved response time. It's effectively submitting that summary information where we can determine, looking at that information, whether there's a likelihood of you meeting the licensing test. So in other words, we can look at the basic information there and we can respond quickly. We would then provide advice, depending on the result of that, we then provide advice towards a full application where there is an actual genuine licensing need, having looked at the screening phase. And again, that form and the related guidance or the associated guidance will be available on gov.uk. But I will share that screening phase form with all of our applicants before, hopefully next week, actually, as I say. If you pass that screening phase, you then move on to what we're going to call a full application. So you'd be invited to apply. And effectively, what this seeks to do really is to prevent people going through the rigmarole of putting all of that information together only to be rejected, actually, because it's missing the key bits of information that we're looking for. And that was certainly something that we found this year. So we want to be able to respond to people really quickly. That's a key thing for us this year. So yeah, if you're invited to apply for a full application, you put in a full application, we'll then assign an advisor to you to take you through that process and help and guide you through that. In terms of the licensing itself, if you were to get through that screening phase and apply in a full application, and actually this relates also to the screening phase to summarize that information, we're still looking for the same things, essentially. Certainly in terms of the purpose, specifically public health and safety purpose, it's really being very explicit about the specific risk. What exactly is the problem? What is the risk to public health and safety? Sounds really obvious, but quite often we don't get enough information on that. Now, from experience, it tends to fall into two rough categories, actually. One is either the buildup of nesting material, and another is aggressive behaviour. But the key point there is, as I put in that bullet point, that it should be clearly defined and discernible from nuisance. And the reason I put that in is that we do get a lot of applications where the circumstances are deemed that those birds are a nuisance, and that is not a licensable purpose in itself. So we can't license that. We can't license the control of birds because they're a nuisance. There's just no provision in the legislation for that. There has to be a very specific risk to health and safety. So moving on in terms of evidence, you've got some basic evidence there in terms of the species in question, whether that's lesser black-backed gull, herring gull, or feral pigeon, perhaps. Numbers of those species relative to each other, and that might include numbers of nests and eggs. More generally, it probably does, actually, in the vast majority of applications. I think one of the key things is the behaviour. When are the birds seen? It's basic information to note down, to share with us. What time of the year? More than likely they're starting to build nests in February time and onwards. Where are they seen? What are they actually doing? Is it nesting material? Where are they flying to and from? A lot of additional information on behaviour is really useful to us. And the final bullet point there is a discernible pattern. And that's really key across lots of areas of licensing, because it's showing that need for a license isn't based on an isolated incident. In other words, an isolated incident may be something that can be tackled by the use of non-lethal methods, for example. So it's showing that there is a pattern to this over time, and it's not an isolated incident, as I say. It's frequently observed. I just mentioned that the non-lethal alternatives, obviously that's a key part of our licensing test. We're effectively saying, this is an option that you're seeking to do. What else have you tried? Why choose this option, in other words? And you must be able to demonstrate that you've tried everything else before essentially asking to carry out lethal control. That can fall into several different categories, as I've mapped out there. The type of non-lethal control, commonly with pest control operators, that would be proofing and deterrence, netting and decoys, falconry, various other things. It's important to map that out, and important to map out what was the reaction to that. Were those types of deterrent used in isolation, or were they used in combination, and did that make any difference, actually? So again, it's telling that story, if you like, that we have no alternative, essentially. That bullet point there, appropriate, it is a key one, actually, because in many cases, and certainly some of the sites that I've dealt with this year, it just isn't possible. To be perfectly reasonable, it isn't possible sometimes to net vast roofs, for example. And it's not possible to, say, use, some kinds of audio deterrents in residential areas, for example. So again, it's expressing that and putting that into the application. The final bullet point there was something that we used this year, you'll be familiar with, was that management plan. And that's effectively putting it all together. It's showing that you've considered everything else before applying for this license. So it's essentially a summary of the overall strategy, what's been going on in the past, and what do you need to do in the future. So yeah, this is sort of the final part of the screening process. Really, is any additional information. It's important to get that key information in. So I've just put a few examples in there of any further details, particularly related to that risk, and being really, really specific about the risk of public health and safety. Whether that's water ingress into a building, pouring onto electrical equipment, for example, or it's large nesting birds, gulls, actually striking children at a school, for example. Coming very close to doing that. Being very specific about that. Again, any additional details there relating to non-lethal methods of control in isolation or in combination. The site in question is useful. A bit of background information on the site in question, what's going on around it can be very useful information. Are there other nests close to that site? Is anybody trying to deter birds from those sites? It's really useful information. And finally, historical records. I put this in because this is obviously very useful in all areas of licensing. But again, we're being reasonable, and we understand that under general license, there was no requirement to send in a report of action, for example, as there is with individual licensing. So in many cases, people didn't record that information, unfortunately. But again, we'll be reasonable with that. But any historical records that you might have to show that pattern of behaviour is extremely useful to us in assessment. So in summary, I'm just looking at the time here. I don't want to hog everything. So in summary, really, it's the first thing to say is that the general licenses and individual licenses are extremely different to each other. That individual license needs has a requirement for information so that we can actually assess it against those tests. Secondly, that we've responded to the feedback that we've had this year from the licensing system this year, and are making some changes. The main one being, as I've talked about, the screening phase early in the new year. Moving on from that, a much more user-friendly application form and associated guidance, and alongside that, communication throughout the application process, whether that's a rejection via screening, during the application itself, and then obviously beyond that, whether that meets a license or it's a rejection in itself. But the key is to carry through that communication right through the process, pre, during, and post. I've just put this final point in really about licensing beyond next year. I think, more generally, Natural England is looking to think about licensing in a more strategic way. There are obviously many benefits for that. And particularly with public health and safety applications involving large gulls in urban areas, there's clearly an opportunity there to perhaps work with organisations and local authorities to try and produce something like a class or an organisational licence, which covers a much wider area, carried by perhaps a local authority who have got a really better understanding of what's going on in their own particular area. So that's something that we're looking into. That's quite a big bit of work, actually. Any organisational licence is a large bit of work, but we're hoping to pilot that with one or two local authorities early next year, and it's something that we're looking into. In a similar way, actually, I don't know if people will be probably not on this call, but in a similar way to our strategic approach to other licensing, like district licensing with Great Crested News. So it's looking at it at a much greater scale, and in combination is much more effective. That brings me to the end of my presentation. Thanks very much for listening, and any questions?
Great, thank you, David. Really appreciate that. If you want to stop sharing your screen for us, and then it can bring our lovely faces up, and people can we can get some questions going. So there's three questions that are coming. I mean, just as a quick note from me to begin with, I'll read them out for you, and I've got a feeling that some of them are going to be asking for advice with regards to specific problems that people may have. And obviously, in support of you and letting everybody know is that you're limited in what direct advice you can give anybody about a particular problem. So if it is something you're struggling to answer, then of course don't feel too pressured with it. But I'll read them out and we see where we go with them. So the first one, we've got Steve Middleton here saying, do you need an individual license to deal with pigeons and gulls, or can you use a general license, or is this just for lethal methods?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I know when there's a change in anything, there always generates a lot of questions. But certainly, the key thing to any licensing is the purpose. So more than likely with you guys, the purpose is going to be to preserve public health and safety. So what I would say is have a look on gov.uk, have a look at the new DEFRA's new general license. That will more than likely cover you for feral pigeon. If you're on a designated site, I don't know, for example, it might be, to use an example, a decommissioning power station, perhaps, which is on a coastal area. It could be in a designated site. You need to check that and make sure you've got consent. But I would have thought for most cases for your members, the feral pigeon will be able to be covered, but check that on gov.uk. It should be covered by the new general license. Gulls remain off the general license. So when I say gulls, I mean herring gull and lesser black gull specifically. I'm talking about those birds that were, until fairly recently on general license. That's across the board for all purposes. You still need to apply for an individual license. The reason for that, of course, is because the reason they were removed from the general license is because their population has declined, particularly in rural areas, but has declined nationally, and they were removed for that purpose. So effectively, we need to give them more protection. We need to keep an eye on the numbers being killed and the eggs and nests destroyed. We need to keep check on that because of the reduction in numbers overall. Is that helpful?
Right.
You
Yeah,
come
absolutely.
and ask me personally, if not, it's fine.
Yeah, no, great. I'm sure if there's any extra bits to that question, they'll put it on there. So we've got a few more coming in now, which is great. Here's a bit of a scenario, which is possibly a scenario for a lot of people. Rob here has said that he's got a large racing stables, horses, that has a problem with, sort of a dozen feral pigeons roosting and posing a risk to the health of the horses and the people working in that environment. So the question was, does he need to proof first before he's allowed to shoot them? As the proofing, it's the cost thing. It's, it's going to be thousands and thousands, and it's weighing that up on when do you, say this is too costly and it's better to actually go and cull them.
Yeah, it covers all manner of different scenarios, doesn't it? Again, what I would say is and this is where general licenses are different. Essentially, the onus is on that person carrying out that activity to make sure they're complying with the law effectively. Public health and safety covers all manner of different scenarios. What I would do is, again, download that general license, the public health and safety general license, and have a look at the conditions. Make sure that you're confident that your actions are covered by that general license. Effectively, that general license is your protection in law. If somebody was to say, "What are you doing?" Well, I'm controlling pigeons for this reason, and under the conditions of this license. So it's familiarize yourself with that. If you think that general license isn't going to cover you for that particular activity, whatever it is you're proposing, then you need to come back to us and talk to us about individual licensing. But again, in most public health and safety, where there is a risk to public health and safety, the control of feral pigeons is covered by that general license. But yeah, please do have a look at the application, have a look at the general license, and familiarise yourself with the new one, particularly because it's just changed. It's a new one.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's quite a common, we're always happy to talk through specific scenarios with our members, and we never give advice as what they should do, but just talking it out with someone can help. So, I think to everybody on here is, if you've got colleagues or, a member of an association or maybe some of your suppliers, you can chat to us and just chat it through. And sometimes that can help them make a decision, can't it? So that's good advice. Great. There's one come up here from Sue that I was actually going to ask you about as well. So with the individual licenses, obviously a big problem this year was the time scale, and how long it took for them to come back. So what's I know you maybe can't be too specific. What's the desirable in terms of time scale from that first screening period to actually getting an approved license?
Yeah, really good question. And of course, we know that licenses are all about timing, aren't they? So the activity is all about timing, particularly when you're talking about controlling eggs and nests. You're looking at requiring that license to carry out activity early on in the year. So we're hoping to, as I say, we're hoping to release the screening phase document next week. And then once we've got feedback on that, made any changes that we need to make, we'll publish that early in January with a view to opening up full applications from the 1st of February. So effectively what we're seeking to do with the screening phase is get ourselves in a position where we can go back to those who are likely to receive a license and be able to focus on those and get those out in February. That's effectively what we're trying to do. And you'd appreciate, you get. Sorry, I was just going to say you get an awful lot of applications effectively all at the same time. Which is fine. That's we anticipate that, and certainly we had that this year. So what we're trying to do is be able to. It's almost like a triage, effectively, to go through those as they come in and pick out and think, right, yeah, we've got the information there we need. We can pass those on for assessment. The others, we can go back to the applicant and say, no, we need X, Y, Z, and be very, very explicit about that, which I think we weren't particularly good at this year.
Great. Fabulous. Okay, so we have Mark Windman. So it says, hi, David, just to pose a scenario for goals, helps us all visualize it. If a site has completed an acceptable application with exhaustive historical data that have tried all proportional distribution and proofing, would egg and nest removal ever be permitted as a long-term population management strategy?
Well, that's really interesting when you talk about the long-term strategy. I mean, and obviously I talked there about organizational licenses, because what we can see, of course, is that through the changes in licensing and survey information is that actually, the problems often persist. They don't necessarily solve the problem. The issue there of egg and nest destruction, yes, that can be effective, but what you've got to be careful of is that you're not seeking to reduce the population for reducing the population's sake, effectively. Then there needs to be a very specific reason why you're proposing what you're doing. So as I say, whether that's nesting material or whether that's aggressive birds that are nesting, attacking people. So in other words, there is a reason why I want to remove the eggs and nests, other than just reducing the population. That in itself isn't enough. You see what I mean? Because your purpose is a specific risk, and that's why I talked a lot in the presentation about being very, very specific about that risk. And it could be that, I don't know, it could be that the owner of a building, clearly has obligations to his staff and people using the building in terms of HASWA 1974, and that they can get in touch with us and say, or get in touch with a contractor, for example, and say, we've got this specific problem. I have a responsibility. We need to remove that nest to remove that problem. Rather than looking at it as we want to reduce the numbers overall. And of course, that's not a good argument in terms of the overall population status of the species, because we've seen a decline. So really, we don't want to be doing that. Is the obvious answer to that. But there are provisions in the legislation to allow you to deal with certain incidents where there's a problem, a very specific problem. So it's thinking about it really specifically rather than generally.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, where having a good knowledge of the licenses is really important. And, we can't express that enough. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. We've got 6 questions still sitting there, but just having a look through, there's sort of, ones that are relatively generic. And you know what, I know that, as BPCA and maybe some suppliers, we can probably help with some of those questions there. So if anybody has got an unanswered question, you can either get in touch with us and we can have a chat about it, or if there's anything specific, I'm sure, David, if we pop that question to you on an email, we can get it out to everybody and just get a more specific answer. But thank you so much for your time. Absolutely. That was amazing. Pleasure to have you.